Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream on HFI podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Bart Ehrman, and today we're going to be discussing the Orthodox corruption of Scripture, the effect of early Christological controversies on the text of the New Testament. And we're going to be discussing the textual changes that had occurred to the New Testament text, different manuscripts in conflict with one another, the different text types, different manuscript families, because there's a lot there to unpack. So welcome back to the show, Bart.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. So what exactly is textual criticism?
Right. So it's a term frequently misunderstood by people who are not scholars, because one would think the textual criticism would be the study of text, so literary, trying to understand like what do the texts mean, or what kind of contradictions are in the text, or things like that. And it's not that. Textual criticism is a technical term that refers to not just in New Testament, but in any field, Shakespearean studies, any kind of literary studies, Milton, whatever. Textual criticism is the attempt to use the surviving texts of a document to determine what the author originally wrote and to see how that was changed. And so if somebody is an expert in Shakespeare, for example, there are different forms of the text of Hamlet. There's not like a single manuscript that goes back to Shakespeare. And so they have to compare the various forms available to try to see what Shakespeare originally wrote. And it's the same thing with the New Testament. Textual criticism is trying to establish the text, trying to know what the author said, and then trying to know how people changed it.
Now, just how many manuscript families of the New Testament are we dealing with here?
Okay, well, so let me just start with the manuscripts. We have over 5,600 manuscripts, which the word manuscript means handwritten copy. And so not ones that have been printed, but ones by, printing press, but handwritten. We have about 5,600 of those. The problem is that there's so many of them that it's very difficult for scholars to examine all of them, because suppose you've got a passage in Matthew, suppose you've got a verse in Matthew, and different manuscripts word this verse differently, and you want to know, well, which wording did the author originally write, and why did somebody change it? And so if you've got hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts just of Matthew, it's not really very useful to be able to have to read through every manuscript at that point. And so what scholars have done since the 18th century is to try and see if there are groups of manuscripts that cohere with one another, so that manuscripts have basically the same kind of text. And so which manuscripts fall into which group? And you know that by looking at the similarities and differences among the various manuscripts. Scholars who are interested in groups of manuscripts then have names for these groups. And when the people who do this kind of grouping agree that there are the various kinds of groups. There are some basic ones: the Alexandrian text, the Western text, the Byzantine text. These are all designations to refer to groups of manuscripts that basically cohere with one another, so that if you know what the group reading is, you don't have to look at every manuscript in the group.
And which one of those manuscript families is typically preferred in reconstructing the New Testament?
So there have been long debates about it. The scholar, so I need to say up front, because some people might know this, that many scholars today have gotten away from the very idea of trying to group manuscripts. I myself have long been interested in establishing family groups, and it's what I did a lot of my early scholarship on, is trying to figure out manuscript groups. Those who do manuscript groups have tended to prefer what's called the Alexandrian text. It's a group of manuscripts that in some way or another appear to be related to scribal activities in the city of Alexandria, Egypt, in the early centuries of Christianity. The largest group is called the Byzantine text. Sometimes it's called the Syrian text. There are various names for it, but it's the majority of manuscripts that come from the Middle Ages. So that people who tend to be very, very conservative evangelical scholars, fundamentalist scholars, often prefer that Byzantine text. And historically, in no small measure, has been because that's the form of the text that the King James Bible is based on, roughly speaking. And so those who think that the King James is the best translation, or those who are doubtful about scholarship since the 19th century, often prefer the Byzantine text. Most other scholars would prefer what we call the Alexandrian text.
What are the major differences between the Byzantine text and the Alexandrian text type?
So when scholars started classifying these groups, they started realizing that there were some key passages that are supported by one group or another. And there are many passages that are sort of readers' favorites that are absent from some of the oldest and best Alexandrian manuscripts, but are found in virtually all of the Byzantine manuscripts. And so, for example, the woman taken in adultery, where this woman is dragged before Jesus for being caught in the act of adultery, and Jesus writes on the ground and stands up, and they want to know, what does Jesus want to do with her? Does he want to condemn her too? And he says, let the one without sin among you be the first to cast a stone at her. They all walk away in shame for their own sins until she's left alone. And Jesus says to her, is there no one here left to condemn you? And she says, no, Lord, no one. And he says, neither do I condemn you, and go and sin no more. Okay, so this is a favorite story. It's in it's in every Jesus movie ever made. And it's found in the Gospel of John, chapter 7 and 8, in the King James Bible, and in most manuscripts from the Byzantine period, but it's not found in the earlier Alexandrian manuscripts. And so it is widely thought then that this was not an original writing of John. It was inserted by a scribe. The Byzantine text tends to be a little bit longer. It tends to be a little bit more full. It tends to be a little more comprehensible. It seems to have fewer kind of problems in ways. And so naturally, some people don't like it, but it appears to be the older form of the text.
How do scholars determine if a text has been edited?
Do you mean edited, or do you mean changed by scribes?
Changed by scribes is really what I meant.
Yeah. So, some people say, look, scribes wouldn't have changed manuscripts. But the reality is, as I said, we've got 5,600 of them, manuscripts, and we can simply compare them to one another. When somebody is starting to be trained in the field of textual criticism, one of the first things they are taught is how to read a handwritten copy, a manuscript. And the writing differed from time to time. The oldest manuscripts are done in what look to us like capital letters. The manuscripts of the Middle Ages look more like what we would think of as cursive writing. But scholars are taught how to read these things. And one of the early tasks that students being trained in this field learn is how to collate a manuscript. Collating a manuscript is when suppose you're comparing two manuscripts with one another to see how they relate to each other. One way to do that is to take each manuscript, instead of comparing each manuscript to each other, what you do is you compare this manuscript to some kind of printed text. You choose which printed text to use, and you find all the places where this manuscript has a difference from the printed text. It might leave out a word someplace. It might add a sentence. It might change the spelling of a word. It might, change the word order. There are things, lots of things that could be changes. you collate the manuscript by finding every single difference, just every minute letter difference between this manuscript and the standard text you're collating against. Collating is comparing a manuscript to a standard text. Then you do the same thing with the second text. You compare all the places where it has something different from the standard text. When you do that, you've got your list of your differences and you can compare them and you can see how many differences these two have in common and how many are different. So what happens if you take all these manuscripts, 5,600 more or more manuscripts, they're all different from each other. Usually not. It's not like, some of them take out 12 chapters from the Gospel of Mark or something. It's not big stuff like that, but word after word after word might be changed in small ways, almost always in small ways. So we know that scribes are changing the texts, and we can tell that how do we know that they were changing the text? Because we have the manuscripts that they produced, and they differ. They differ. I said we have over 5,600 manuscripts. The difference among these manuscripts are in the hundreds of thousands, the differences. And most of the differences don't matter for much, but they're different. And so somebody's changing something. Otherwise, they'd all be the same.
So basically, you're saying that the differences are usually small; they're not major. So how does one sort out between the small differences to know which one of them is the better reading?
Well, you do it the same way you do with the major readings. You have a set of criteria that you use to evaluate which is which. The small ones, they really don't matter a lot of so of these hundreds of thousands of differences, probably the majority of them would be spelling differences. And the way you spell the word Beelzebub, whether you call him Beelzebub or Beelzebul or something else, doesn't affect the meaning at all. And so you still have to decide, though, if you are suppose you're a publisher and you want to publish an edition of the Greek New Testament, which would be in printed form. Well, you have to decide what to print. Do you print Beelzebul? Do you print Beelzebub? And so for both the minor differences and for the really major differences, there are criteria that scholars use in order to decide what probably is the oldest form of the text. I'm happy if you'd like to hear, I can describe these criteria, but it would take a while.
So are any two of the New Testament manuscripts identical?
Well, no two of the full manuscripts. When I say there are 5,600 plus, I'm including tiny little things like, so I'm including not just full manuscripts that start with Matthew and end with the Revelation and have every word. I'm also including you'll have a copy of Luke that'll be missing 3 pages, and it'll be just Luke missing 3 pages. Or you'll have 1 page from Paul's letter to the Romans. Sometimes we just have a little scrap. The oldest manuscript we have, it's called P52. So it's papyrus. It's P for papyrus. It's written on papyrus. Which is the older manuscripts are written on papyrus, and it's the 52nd one that was cataloged by the official cataloging place. So it's called P52. It's the size of a credit card. It's in a kind of a triangular shape, and it's got a few lines from John chapter 18 on the front and a few lines from John chapter 19 on the back. It was the account of Jesus' trial before Pilate. The rest of that page was destroyed, maybe wore out or got thrown out or something. The rest of this Gospel of John, all we have is this one little scrap. So we have things from that to entire manuscripts. There will be places where you'll have a little fragment like that will be just like for those verses in some other manuscript, but you'll never have like a manuscript that has a number of pages that'll be exactly like another manuscript that has the same pages. There are always some kinds of small differences and often larger ones.
So, do we know how many interpolations had occurred in the New Testament? Or maybe I should rephrase it and say, how many interpolations do we so far know have occurred in the New Testament?
So this is another technical term, interpolation, as it turns out. So interpolation is a kind of textual change where somebody's added something to the text. So like, for example, if you've got two texts and a scribe has like omitted a word, maybe, but he just like his eye skipped over, he just missed it, didn't write it down. That would not be an interpolation. That would be an omission. And so there are all these but I think you're asking how many textual variants there are, how many differences among the manuscripts. When I was writing my dissertation back in a long time ago, back in the Pleistocene age, sometime in the early 80s, the common sense was there were about 300,000 or maybe even 400,000 differences in our manuscripts. Some of them omissions, some of them additions, changes of word ordering, changes of word, misspellings, everything. 300,000 or 400,000. And the most recent estimates have raised that number to 500,000 or more. We haven't been able to know for sure because we haven't been able to collate all the manuscripts, as odd as that seems. Even with the advances of computer technology, there are manuscripts we haven't fully studied yet. And so, but it's today, I think a common number is 400,000 or more likely 500,000.
Why was Luke 3:22 corrected to parallel Mark 1:11?
Okay, so now we're getting
Mhm.
into the weeds. Okay, so I luckily brought my Greek New Testament with me, so I can make sure. But this particular verse I'm very familiar with because this is a very important passage because Luke has a very different reading from what you find in Mark. It's a passage that's dealing with Jesus' baptism. In Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel begins with Jesus being baptized. It starts out with John the Baptist. And so in Mark, there's no birth narrative. There's nothing about a virgin birth or Bethlehem or anything like that. It starts with John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is making his proclamation that people need to repent for the forgiveness of their sins. And Jesus, and he's baptizing all these people, and Jesus comes to be baptized by him. And in Mark, Jesus gets baptized, and as he comes up out of the water, the heavens split open, and the Spirit of God descends upon Jesus, and he hears a voice that says, "You are my son. In you are my beloved son. In you, I'm well pleased." So that's interesting because the voice in Mark's gospel, and only in Mark's gospel, is speaking directly to Jesus. You are my beloved son. One reason that's interesting is because when you get to Matthew, it's changed to "This is my beloved son." And so the voice changes from Mark to Matthew, which might be significant for interpretation. Luke has a very different thing. In Luke's gospel, Jesus gets baptized. He comes up out of the water. The Spirit comes down. Heavens open up, and he hears the voice. And in this case, there are different manuscripts that read differently about what the voice says. And so in the majority of manuscripts, in manuscripts of the Byzantine type, the voice, in fact, is what the voice is in the Gospel of Mark. You are my beloved son, in you I'm well pleased. Let me make sure I get this correct. Yep. So that is a quotation, by the way, of Psalm chapter 2, verse 7. No, I'm sorry. That is a quotation. Wait, let me get all this straight. That is a quotation of Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1. Isaiah chapter 42, verse 1. Now I'm getting it all mucked up. Textual criticism is very confusing, Jacob. All right, let me do this again. You are my beloved son, in you I'm well pleased. That's Isaiah 42. Some old manuscripts have the voice saying something different. Instead of quoting Isaiah 42, it quotes Psalm 2:7. In those manuscripts, the voice says, you are my son. Today I have begotten you, or brought you into being as my son. You are my son. Today I've begotten you. Psalm chapter 2, Psalm 2:7. And so what scholars have to debate then, which reading did Luke originally write? Which one did he write? Did he write the one that sounds just like Mark? Or did he write the one that sounds different from Mark? It's a big issue, because if the voice at the baptism says, you are my son, today I have begotten you, that would suggest that Jesus became the Son of God at his baptism. Today I have made you my son. Whoa. And so which is it? So scholars have to debate. And in this particular case, what's interesting is that very few manuscripts have the one, today I have begotten you. The vast majority have, you are my beloved son. But there are really good reasons for thinking that originally Luke wrote, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So I have a couple books that deal with this issue. This podcast, this episode, you're calling The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And that's the title of the book that I have that discusses this passage and many others at length, trying to show what the original text is and trying to show why it got changed. And in that book, and also in my shorter book, that's Jesus, which is not written for scholars, it's written for a lay audience, but I explain the issue there in the book about this verse. In both books, I explain why it looks pretty clear that originally the voice said, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Even though it's not in very many manuscripts, one of the questions you have to ask yourself if you're a textual critic is, suppose you're a scribe, and suppose you're trying to analyze what scribes would be likely to do to a text that they've changed, okay? You've got a scribe who wrote one of these, you've got a scribe who wrote the other one. Which scribe would have wanted to change the text? Because one of them did change the text. And so would a scribe who said, you're my beloved son, in you I'm well pleased, is there some problem with that a scribe would think, wait a second, that can't be right? And he changes it to, you are my beloved, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Well, when scribes are copying these texts in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, scribes did not think, by that time, Christianity was pretty convinced that Jesus did not become the Son of God at his baptism. But some groups of Christians, heretics, were using verses like this to say, this is when Jesus became the Son of God. He wasn't really born of a virgin. He really didn't pre-exist. He did not become incarnate. He was a man who became God's son at the baptism. There were Gnostic groups, for example, that argued that. Okay, so you're a scribe and you've come across this verse, you are my son, today I've begotten you. Would you be likely to want to change the text? Well, yes, because Mark's version is innocuous. And so you change it to Mark's version. And then you don't have a problem with theology anymore because God doesn't say this is the day. And so since the text that would cause scribes the most problems is one text, and the other wouldn't cause them any problems, it's the other text. The text that is going to cause problems is more likely to be what the author wrote. Now, I just want to say, in concluding this little bit here, that this is not some kind of crazy criterion dreamt up by liberal scholars. This criterion is one that goes back to the 18th century to a scholar named Johannes Bengel, who was a very, very pious Lutheran theologian who developed this criterion. And the way he put it in Latin, but basically the English translation of what he said was, the more difficult reading is to be preferred. That means if everything else is equal and you've got these two verses and one would really cause difficulties for a scribe and one wouldn't cause really much of any difficulty, then it's more likely a scribe's going to change the difficult one to make it non-problematic than he would to take a non-problematic verse and change it into something difficult. And so this passage appears to have been changed by scribes who were offended at the idea that Christ became the Son of God at the baptism.
So would you say that that is similar to, because you mentioned that it's similar to what Gnostic groups think, and like maybe individuals like Corinthus and also the Gospel of the Ebionites, which talks about that the Christ did some sort of angelic possession of Jesus, and he became Jesus Christ, and therefore Jesus became the Son of God at the baptism.
Yeah, so we know about these Gnostic groups going back into the 2nd century who thought precisely this. From the beginning of Christianity, there was always this question about how Jesus can be both divine and human. How can he be both at once? And I think many people today have a kind of a simple answer to that. And, many listeners have an idea about it. But the idea is that developed over time, and there were lots of options in early Christianity. There were some people who said that Jesus was completely God and he wasn't human at all. And there were other people who said that Jesus was completely human and wasn't God at all. And there are other people who said that Jesus Christ is two things. You got the man, Jesus, and the divine Christ. So something like that was put forward by Gnostic Christians who believed that there was a man, Jesus. He was born of the sexual union of Joseph and Mary. He's a human being, but he was very righteous. And there's a entire divine realm up above us. It's not just one God. There's like a kind of an original God, but there are lots of divine beings that are in this divine realm. And to provide salvation, one of them came down to earth in order to communicate the truths necessary for people to escape this material world to join the spirits up in heaven. In this system, this being, sometimes you could call him the Christ, comes down and enters into the man Jesus when he's baptized. And that's why Jesus starts teaching his fantastic teachings at that point and not before. That's why he can do miracles at that point and not before, because at this point, the divine element has come into Jesus at his baptism. You're my son, today I have begotten you. And in some circles, some of these Gnostic circles, the divine Christ then left Jesus when he was crucified. And that's why on the cross in Mark's gospel, for them, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you left me behind? Why have you forsaken me? It's sometimes translated, but it's the word for being left behind. In other words, the divine element has left the man Jesus, and he's wondering, why have you left me now when he's dying? So the spirit comes, the divine figure comes into Jesus at his baptism and takes him out of the world at his crucifixion. And this verse might have been useful for people who had views like that.
So that modification in Luke 3:22, do we know when that happened?
It is usually thought that almost all of the surviving variant readings that we have were made sometime after the books were written up until over the next 200 years or so. So it's usually thought that around the year 300, you're not getting too many major changes in the text. You get some, but not too many major ones. This particular change from "You are my son, today I've begotten you" to "You are my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased" is found in some of our earliest. That change is found in some of our earliest manuscripts, and so it looks like it must have been changed sometime in the 3rd century at least. So maybe the 2nd or the 3rd century. We don't have manuscripts that would be earlier than that. The passage that says, "Today I have begotten you," is found in just a couple of manuscripts, but it's also quoted that way in church fathers going back to Justin, who was living in the year 150.
So I'm going to take this super chat question from Terry Traster. Thank you for your super chat. You say Jesus was crucified and his followers believe they saw him later. You say you don't have a problem with the resurrection being of a spirit and mass hallucination explaining sightings, correct?
Kind of, but not quite. I don't think there. I'm not a Christian. I don't think there was a resurrection at all. In the way to kind of try and contextualize this question a little bit is that the Jesus himself, of course, was Jewish. His followers were Jewish. They were all Jewish. The people who declared that he was raised from the dead were Jewish. And in Jewish circles, there was not this conception that we know of in Israel at the time, or of what later came to be the Christian idea that the spirit and the body were separable, so that the body could die, but the spirit could live on. The idea of resurrection is a decidedly Jewish idea. You don't get ideas of resurrection, for example, in Greek thinking or Roman thinking. In Greek and Roman thinking, if there's an afterlife, if somebody dies and then they continue existing, it'll be because their bodies died, but their spirit lives on. In a situation like that, you could have a spirit resurrection. You die, your spirit lives on and kind of appears like a ghost or something to people. But that's not the case with the early followers of Jesus because they were Jewish. In Jewish thinking, there's not a separation of the body and the soul where the soul or the spirit can live on when the body dies. In Jewish thinking, the body and the soul are integrated. The human being is an integrated being of body and soul, or body and spirit, so that the human doesn't exist anymore once the body dies, because when the body dies, the spirit dies as well. The ancient thinking in Judaism was that the spirit within you is more like your breath. When God created Adam, he made a lump of clay and a humanoid shape, and it was just a lump of clay on the ground. But then he breathed into it, and the breath is what made it a living being, made it a human being. Well, okay, so the spirit is your breath. That's what makes you alive. Today, when somebody dies and they stop breathing, you don't ask, where'd the breath go? Where's the breath now? It doesn't, no, we know it doesn't exist. Well, that's what Jews in the days of Jesus thought about death. When you're not breathing, when your spirit's not in you, the spirit doesn't exist somewhere. The person's dead now. And the only way the person can come back to life is if the breath is put back into him, if the spirit will re-enter the body. So the disciples, when they believed that Jesus was raised from the dead, as good Jewish believers who this was the only view they knew, if they thought he came back from the dead, necessarily that meant that the breath went back into the body. So the spirit was reunited with the body, and Jesus became a living being again. So they did not believe in the resurrection of a spirit. There's not a spirit resurrection for these people. It's a resurrection by definition is bodily. So I think the disciples some of them believed in a bodily resurrection, and we do have records of multiple people seeing Jesus, including groups of people. Historically, I don't know whether groups of people claim to see Jesus. I personally, I'm not a Christian. I don't think anybody saw Jesus. I don't think he reappeared in any form. But those who saw him early on, Peter and Paul, etc., thought they were seeing a body. If he did, if later you have groups like the 12 disciples, suppose they all said, we saw him. If they say that, then, I think that would have been a group hallucination. And if you say, well, you can't have group hallucinations, then I say, well, yes, you can, because they happen all the time. I often will have Protestant evangelical apologists tell me, look, you can't have a group hallucination. And then I'll say, well, do you think Mary showed up to 1,000 people at this particular point? And I name its time and place. And they'll say, well, no, of course not. So, well, they all said she did. So either she did or it's a group hallucination. So you pick. Since they're Protestants, they don't believe Mary is showing up to people, and so they have to agree. Yeah, okay. Well, they thought they saw something they didn't really see. Well, okay. If you say that about this group, you can say about this other group. And so I don't think that group hallucinations are out of the question. I think that there might have been groups who thought they saw Jesus.
I feel like my next question is the perfect follow-up to that super chat. When was Mark 16:9-20 added to the Gospel of Mark?
Okay, so these are usually known as the last 12 verses of Mark, about which there's been controversy, although I'd say today there's far less controversy about these verses than there are about the passage about the baptism. There still are scholars who will say the passage of the baptism, that it got changed the other way, the opposite way from what I'm saying. But in this case, scholars are really pretty unified, except for fundamentalist scholars. I don't know of any scholars, apart from Christian fundamentalists, who think that the last 12 verses of Mark were original. So to set the stage for what I want to say about it, I need to say something about what's going on in these verses. So at the end of Mark's gospel, Jesus has been crucified. He's been buried by Joseph of Arimathea on a Friday afternoon. On a Sunday morning, women come to the tomb to provide a more proper burial. On the Friday afternoon, Joseph was rushed because the sun was going down. The body had to be put in the tomb before sunset, according to Jewish law. And so he hurriedly buried the body, rolled a stone in front of it. So the women are going to the tomb in the next chapter, and they're wondering, how are we going to get the stone away from the door of the tomb? And when they show up, though, the stone's already been rolled away. And there's a young man there who says, you're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He's not here. He's been raised from the dead. Go tell Peter and the disciples that he will meet them in Galilee. So the angel, or the man, he's called a man, a young man, tells the women to inform the disciples so they can meet Jesus in Galilee. And then the next verse says, this is Mark chapter 16, verse 8. The next verse says, the women, though, fled from the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. Period. End of gospel. Man, it is a great ending, because the women don't tell. And it's not like they told them the next day or something. They never told anybody. They didn't tell anything to anyone, for they were afraid. And so the gospel ends without the disciples learning that Jesus has been raised from the dead, which is altogether appropriate, because throughout this entire gospels, the disciples never could figure out who Jesus is. And at the end, they still don't figure out who he is. Throughout this gospel, Jesus will heal somebody and say, don't tell anyone, and to go out and tell everybody. Here, the women are told to tell, and they don't tell anyone. So it's just reversed. Don't tell, they do tell. Do tell, they don't tell. And so it's this brilliant ending. But you get to that ending, and it says they didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. And you think, whoa, wait a second. What do you mean? Jesus didn't appear to the disciples? How can that possibly be? And so scribes had exactly the same reaction. They came to the end and they said, whoa, wait a second. What? How could that be? And so they knew that the other gospels talk about Jesus appearing to people, and appearing to the disciples, and convincing them he's raised from the dead. And so Mark didn't end that way, but the scribes added an ending, and those are the last 12 verses. Verses 9 and following, the last 12 verses, are the verses that have what happened. These next verses that were added by scribes is that the women go and tell the disciples that Jesus has been raised from the dead, and the disciples go to Galilee and they meet with Jesus, and Jesus has a final talk with them where he tells them to go make disciples and go spread the word throughout the world, and anyone who believes in him will be able to speak in foreign tongues. They'll be able to handle snakes. They'll be able to drink poison, and it won't hurt them. And then he departs from them. Okay. These verses, by the way, are verses that are used by the Appalachian snake handlers to justify their practices of handling snakes and services, because Jesus says you'll be able to. I've always thought that somebody in the ambulance on the way to the hospital taking one of these guys in for treatment should tell them, actually those verses were not originally in Mark. They're not in the Bible originally. But yeah. So anyway, Jacob, your question is, when were these verses first added to the text? And so we have manuscripts that have this verse starting around the year 400. And so they're in several of the key passages, and it may be that they are cited somewhat before that in a couple of church fathers, although it's not quite clear. It's not quite clear if they're citing precisely these verses in this place. So the answer, sometime in the late 3rd or early 4th century, is probably when this text was added.
I'd like to shift to Matthew real quick, because we've been talking about Mark, Luke, and a little bit about John, but let's take a look at some corruption going on in Matthew. You talk about Matthew 24:36 in comparison to Mark 13:32, I think, in page 107. You talk about how that was problematic for Christians.
Right. So, okay. So you're referring to in my book, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. Right. So, 24:36. So that's,
yeah.
Yeah. So that's the business of the hold on a second. 24:36. I thought you were talking about the spear in the side. You're not talking about that one? About the soldier putting the spear in the side?
No, I'm talking about Matthew 24:36. Concerning that day and hour, no one knows, never the angels of heaven.
No. Yeah, no, that's I'm sorry, you got it's not. I thought you said, oh God, no, I'm in the wrong chapter. I thought you said, for some reason, I thought you were talking about 27 something. Okay.
No, it's page
27.
107. 107.
Well, yeah, I don't have that in front of me, but I should have memorized my pages, but I didn't. So, okay. All right. Yeah. Okay. So this is the passage of Jesus is talking to the disciples about the end of the age. This is in Jesus' apocalyptic discourse. Mark has Jesus in chapter 13 of Mark has Jesus describing when what's going to happen at the end of time. With the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and then all sorts of cosmic signs, and then the coming of the Son of Man. You have a similar thing in Matthew, but Matthew has a longer speech of Jesus. And in Matthew's version, you have this line where Jesus says that the Son of Man is going to be coming, and so forth and so on. But he says no one knows the day or the hour when the Son of Man will come, no one knows the day or the hour when the Son will come, not the angels, nor even the Son, but God alone. And that phrase, not even the Son, is problematic. And you can see why scribes would find it problematic, because it suggests that the Son of God is not all-knowing. He's not. But if he's not all-knowing, how is he God? I mean, God has to be all-knowing. And surely Jesus knows when the end's going to come. he's the one coming. So surely he knows when. So that was a view that scribes had. They thought, well, it seems that doesn't seem right. And so they took out the line, not even the Son. So in the change form of the text, then it's no one knows the day or the hour, not the angels in heaven, but only the Father. And so it does not any longer say not even the Son. And that way they got rid of the problem.
So now we're going to take another super chat. Julia, thank you for your super chat. No question there. Hard work. Thank you for your super chat. Would Bart mind explaining his favorite addition, favorite feature addition coming to NA29 that he's excited about?
I would talk about it if I had any idea what's going to be in Nestle Aland 29. And so the NA, for those who don't know, that refers to the Nestle Aland edition of the Greek New Testament. The it's the standard form of the Greek New Testament that scholars use. This is an older version of it here. This is this one has English on one side and Greek on the other. The Greek side's the one that matters for us, and it has the text with a list of the textual changes found in some of our major manuscripts. This is called the apparatus. The apparatus is that is where they provide in condensed form a description of a number of the changes, nowhere near all of the changes, and nowhere near in all the manuscripts. This edition was first put out by a man named Nestle, and then later it was edited by a man named Aland. And so now it's called the Nestle Aland. It's currently in the 28th edition. It's going to now come into the 29th edition. From what I have gathered from the scholarship that is being done on this, most of the scholarship is being done in Münster, Germany. The kinds of changes that I've heard about them making in the 29th edition are not hugely significant in terms of like big things. I don't know of any big things. It's more like changing a word here and there. They may change some of the important passages, but I don't know that they are. And so when they talk about when the group in Münster talks about how they're changing the text, they'll sometimes give a list. Like in the Book of Acts, these will be the change. These are the changes we're going with, and very rarely do they have any effect on the meaning of the text. So I'm not expecting anything big. I think it'll be really important for scholars because it will have additional evidence for the various different readings, and it will change the text in some places, but I don't think any place significantly.
Can you tell us about any other major interpolations that occurred in the Gospel of Matthew?
Well, there are lots of changes that were made in Matthew. One of my favorite ones comes early on in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew. So to set the stage, in Matthew gives a genealogy of Jesus that traces his family, his parental line, all the way back to Abraham, the father of the Jews. And so it's the very beginning of the gospel. It's not that long of a genealogy. It only takes about 15 or 16 verses. But so Matthew begins by saying the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And so Abraham's the father of the Jews, and the genealogy starts with Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and it goes on like that. And it goes all the way down to Joseph. Jacob was the father of, do it this way. Mathan was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Joseph. And then you have a comment about Jesus. So Joseph, so this is the one married to Mary, or betrothed to Mary. Joseph was the father of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, who is called the Christ. When it says from whom, in Greek, the whom is feminine. And so it's saying that Jesus was born from Mary. It's a very interesting genealogy for lots of reasons. One reason is because Luke also has a genealogy of Jesus that goes down to Joseph. That is a different genealogy. Joseph has a different father, different grandfather, different great-grandfather, all the way back to King David in Luke's genealogy. But another interesting thing is that just within Matthew, this is a genealogy of Jesus that gives a genealogical tree that Jesus does not belong to. This is a patrilinear descent. In other words, from father to son, Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Joseph, etc., going down to Judah, going down all the way to Joseph. But then Jesus is not related to Joseph because in Matthew, Jesus' mother is a virgin. Joseph has not gotten her pregnant. And so the genealogical line goes to Joseph, but it's broken at that point because Jesus doesn't belong to it because he's not Joseph's son. And so why do you have a genealogy of Jesus that he doesn't belong to? It's a really interesting question. One of the many interesting questions about Matthew. And, if you want a fuller exposition of this and a fuller description of the genealogy, because there are other problems in this genealogy of Matthew, I have this course on my, if you look at on my webpage, bartehrman.com, I have a course on the Gospel of Matthew, an 8-lecture course where I devote a lot of time explaining the problems of this genealogy and trying to explain them all. But for here, Jacob's asking about the textual variant, an interesting textual variant. I think this one's pretty interesting because that last line is changed in some manuscripts. So the original appears to have said what this edition has, that Jacob was the father of Joseph. So Jacob begot Joseph, the husband of Mary, from whom was born Jesus, the one who's called the Christ. Okay, so Jesus is born of Mary. But you have changes. In one manuscript, for example, or several manuscripts, you have this. Jacob begot Joseph, to whom was betrothed the Virgin Mary. To whom, being betrothed, the Virgin Mary begot Jesus, the one who is called the Christ. So this emphasizes that Jesus is not related to Joseph because she's a virgin. And so like it's emphasizing that in the genealogy, which more or less, intensifies the problem. Except that it would intensify, except when it says this, it actually has Joseph as the subject of the verb. So it says, being betrothed to whom Joseph begot Jesus, the one who's called the Christ. Wait a second. What? And so, right. So it tends to be a little bit confusing. But in that change, probably made, I don't know, somebody wasn't paying attention. It turns out Joseph was the father. And it certainly solved the problem of the genealogy. So anyway, yeah.
I like to circle back to Mark. In Mark 1:1, you note that there is a variance there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. This is one that's much more debated because it's a complicated issue. Actually, this one's a particularly complicated issue. So Mark begins his gospel differently. There's no genealogy. There's no birth narrative. Mark begins by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That's the way it's found in this earlier edition of the Nestle Aland. What I just read is a translation, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But they put the term Son of God in brackets. Why do they put it in brackets? They put it in brackets because they're not sure those two words were originally there. There are some manuscripts that begin by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. Then they go on to talk about the appearance of John the Baptist and Jesus being baptized. Now, I pointed out that we've got some manuscripts of Luke that have Jesus being baptized, and it looks like in the original text of Luke, God makes Jesus his son at the baptism. In Mark, the voice of the baptism is, "You are my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." That comes later. In this verse, though, the question is, did it originally say Son of God at the beginning or not? Many scholars have taken this verse, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, to be the actual title of this book. That Mark wrote that line not as the first verse, but as the title. You don't have verse numbers in the old manuscripts, of course, and Mark didn't have verse numbers; those are added much later. So the beginning. So is it the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, or the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God? Why does it matter? It's the same thing, right? Yeah, well, kind of. And in fact, in the Gospel of Mark, there's a large emphasis on Jesus being the Son of God. Big emphasis in Mark on Jesus being the Son of God. The term Son of God for Jesus is not used very often in Mark. It's not used often, but it's used in the key places. It occurs at the baptism. First thing Jesus does, he gets baptized. The voice says, "You are my beloved son." It occurs at the transfiguration. Jesus almost exactly halfway through the gospel, Jesus goes up on the Mount of Transfiguration, and he's transfigured before the disciples, and the voice comes from heaven and again says, "This is my son." It comes a third time when Jesus is crucified. This time, it's not the voice of God. This time, it's the centurion who's just crucified Jesus, who sees how Jesus died. He apparently sees that the curtain in the temple has been ripped. He sees how Jesus has died, and the centurion says, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." So it happens at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so, kind of the point is Jesus is the Son of God. So there would be nothing weird about Mark beginning his gospel, the first verse, by saying the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That wouldn't be that unusual, but why is it missing from manuscripts? Did scribes actually take it out? Why would a scribe take it out if it's perfectly in Mark? Would a scribe have added it? Well, there's actually a reason for thinking they might have added it. I will say that a number of scholars, it's hard for me to do this without a whiteboard. I'm not going to try my whiteboard here, but it's a little hard for me to do this. But a number of scholars think that the words were taken out by accident. And the reason is this sentence, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words here. Tu euangeliou Iesu Christou huiou theou. They all 5 end in the letters in English OU, omicron upsilon in Greek. So they all end the same way. So the name Jesus Christ is spelled out here. The word Son of God is spelled out here. But in ancient manuscripts, they would have likely abbreviated these words, because these are among those words that scribes typically abbreviated. Words that, like Jesus and Christ and God and Son and David, and they're a group of about 15 words that scribes would abbreviate, because they appeared so much that they just abbreviate them with a little line over the top to tell you it's an abbreviation. But if that's the case, then the words would have been abbreviated, and they would have, so instead of Iesu Christou huiou theou, it'd be like just a few letters instead of like the entire words. The theory that scholars have is that scribes wrote Iesu Christou with abbreviations and wrote the omicron upsilon, the OU at the end of Christou. Their eye went back to the page and they landed on the omicron upsilon, the OU at the end of theou. And it's just a few letters. And so their eye skipped from a few letters to the next few letters, and they thought those were the words they had copied, and they didn't. So they went to the next word. They left out these 2 words. Okay. These words ended the same way. And so this is a case of what scholars call homoioteliuton, words ending the same way. And so you just accidentally leave out some words because when your eye goes back to the word you just copied, you go to the end of the word and you think you just got, okay. So that's a possibility. I don't think it's plausible. I don't think this, usually scribes do that when they're kind of tired, and they just make mistakes because they've been copying all day and they're tired. But you begin a gospel like, you're fresh and alert. You start right in when you start a new gospel. So, it seems unlikely that within the first 6 words, the first 7 words, they were so tired they missed a couple. So I don't think it's done accidentally. If it's done on purpose, I can't see any reason for somebody to take the words out, Son of God, but I can see a reason for somebody adding the word Son of God. The reason for adding them is precisely what I said before. There are some Christian groups who think that Jesus became the Son of God at the baptism. That's when he became the Son of God, and he was the Son of God at the end until he became the Son of God, and then the Son of God, then Christ left him at the end, so that the Gnostic view. Gnostics liked the Gospel of Mark, especially because of the ending. My God, why have you left me behind? But this Gnostic view is dependent on Christ becoming the Son of God at the baptism. Why would scribes add the phrase Son of God to the first verse before the baptism? Because then it becomes clear that Jesus is the Son of God all the way through, not starting with the baptism. And so what I argue in my book, it's a long argument, it gets a bit in the weeds, but what I argue is scribes added the phrase Son of God in order to counter a Gnostic reading of the Gospel of Mark.
Did that addition also happen sometime in the second or third centuries, like with that other variant we discussed earlier?
Probably. It appears to be quoted this way in the writings of Irenaeus, who is writing in the 180s of the Common Era. So it appears that he knew of a manuscript that was missing. We only have a few manuscripts that are missing it. One of the manuscripts, make sure I get this right. Yeah, one of the manuscripts that is missing it is a very fine 4th century manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus. So, but is also, as I said, it appears to be unknown to Irenaeus, and shortly after Irenaeus to Origen, a church father in the early 3rd century.
So based on what you said about the modifications that were done to the Gospel of Luke, did the original Gospel of Luke did it not have a virgin birth story? Was that added later to counter the idea that Jesus became the Son of God at the baptism?
Now this is a really difficult question, and it's going to take me a while. If you don't mind, Jacob, do you mind if I take a while on this one?
Please, go ahead.
Because this is tricky. This now is dealing with a different situation, because all of our manuscripts have Luke chapters 1 and 2. These are the account of Jesus' virgin birth to Mary in Bethlehem. Joseph and Mary are betrothed. They're not married yet, but there's a worldwide census, and they have to go to Bethlehem to register for the census, because Joseph comes from the lineage of King David, who was from Bethlehem. And so he has to go register for the census in Bethlehem, and he and Mary go to Bethlehem. And while she's there, she goes into labor. She's 9 months pregnant or whatever. She goes into labor and she gives birth. And so Jesus is born in Bethlehem. So that's chapter 2 of Luke. Chapter 1 of Luke is actually about the prediction of the birth of John the Baptist, and the birth of John the Baptist, and prediction of the birth of Jesus, and then you get this thing in chapter 2. So you got 1 and 2, a very long 2 chapters dealing with the first the birth of John the Baptist, but mainly the birth of Jesus. These are in all the manuscripts. They're not missing from any manuscript. And so what we're talking about now is not a textual variant. A textual variant is a different reading found in different manuscripts. In this case, chapters 1 and 2 are in all the manuscripts. And so the issue does not involve manuscripts differing from each other. But there are reasons for thinking in this case that the passage missing in Luke, the passage, Luke chapters 1 and 2, were originally not in Luke, even though they're in all the manuscripts. So it's a long, complicated argument. I'm going to be talking about it. I've got another course coming up in November on the Gospel of Luke. That's kind of like my Matthew course, only it's about Luke, in which I'll be talking about this at some length. And I've talked about it on my blog a number of times. If you know about my blog, you can go and find it there. But I agree with those scholars who think that Luke 1 and 2 were not original. Let me give you just several of the reasons for thinking so. First, the writing style of Luke chapters 1 and 2 is very different from what you find in the rest of Luke's gospel. It reads much more like the biblical accounts that you find in the Old Testament. The writing style is more like the Greek Old Testament than anything that shows up in chapter 3 of Luke and following. So that doesn't mean anything much, but it's worth noting anyway. Second thing to note is the way chapter 3 of Luke begins sounds like it's beginning a brand new book. It sounds like the start of a book. It's dating the events that are going to take place. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias tetrarch of Abilene, in the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John. And so John, the son of Zechariah. And so it sure sounds like he's beginning a book, because you begin a book by dating when the events are going to take place. Well, why would you do that here if already you've got 2 chapters to kind of set it up? So that's a little bit odd. Again, it's not completely completely out of order, but it is worth noting. But there are other things to talk about. One is that the idea of the virgin birth is not mentioned anywhere else in Luke or in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. It's written as the second volume of Luke, and it describes the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman world after Jesus' resurrection and ascension. So, okay, that's fine. But the book of Acts sometimes refers back to Luke. And when it does, it summarizes what happened in Luke by talking about the things Jesus said and did. It doesn't say anything about Jesus being born of a virgin in its summaries. And in fact, so virgin birth is never mentioned in Acts. None of the apostles who preached to convert people says anything about the virgin birth. So you have that. You also have the fact that Jesus is never portrayed as somebody who, so he's never portrayed as somebody who came from a virgin in the rest of the book. Jesus, throughout the book, seems to be thought of, in the book of Acts, seems to be thought of as somebody who became the Son of God at the baptism. And in fact, in Luke 3:22, as we've talked about, it appears that Jesus did become the Son of God at the baptism. And so if he became the Son of God at the baptism, how could he be born the Son of God to a virgin? You see, so you start mounting up these various arguments, and they all point in the same direction. And so there are other arguments that I give in my stuff. I don't need to go into them here, but I will say that for these reasons, there are a number of scholars who think that, in fact, these 2 chapters were added to Luke before any of our manuscripts were produced. And so they're a secondary addition to Luke. So Luke originally began with chapter 3, verse 15. And that's why later there's no word about the virgin birth, no word about Bethlehem, no word about the census, nothing about Joseph. It's all because that stuff was added later. Why would it be added later? Why would you have somebody add Luke chapters 1 and 2? Well, for one thing, you've got the virgin birth now, so it's not just found in Matthew. This virgin birth story wasn't taken from Matthew because the stories are completely different, but it achieves the end of showing that Jesus was actually the Son of God from his birth. against Gnostics who would say, no, actually it happened at his baptism. And so it could serve some value there. It's valuable as well because it makes very clear connections to the Old Testament, linking Jesus to prophets of the Old Testament and to prophecy in the Old Testament, which furthers the Orthodox cause against those Christians in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries who were saying that, in fact, the Old Testament is not a Christian book and that Jesus is not related to the Old Testament. Well, now he is, based on these chapters, and so on. So there are lots of reasons for thinking these chapters were added to Luke, but added before any of our surviving manuscripts. Another thing to point out, an interesting point, is that church fathers roundly attacked a 2nd century heretic named Marcion because he had a view of God and Christ and salvation that they didn't agree with, and he had some kind of form of the Gospel of Luke. He had some form of the Gospel of Luke that is not like our Gospel of Luke. We know this because church fathers talk about it, and one of the things they say about it is that Marcion's version of the Gospel of Luke did not have chapters 1 and 2. What they maintain is that that Marcion cut out those chapters, that he sliced them out of his copy of Luke. But given everything else, it may be that Marcion simply knows a different form of Luke, one that did not have a birth narrative.
So, did the redactor, whoever that person was, that added the first 2 chapters to Luke, could that person have possibly have known Matthew and maybe didn't like Matthew's infancy story, didn't like Matthew's genealogy, and as a response used Luke, which in a sense served as an empty vessel because it didn't have that stuff, to create different stuff to contradict Matthew? Or is even those 2 chapters that were added later to Luke in of itself independent of Matthew, as Luke's original text was?
I don't think there's anything to suggest that the author of Luke 1 and 2 modeled his stories about the virgin birth on Matthew. And it's largely because the only things they have in common are the very, very broad themes, which anybody talking about Jesus' virgin birth would be familiar with. And so his mother Mary is a virgin. She's betrothed to someone named Joseph. So they've obviously never had sex. He's born in Bethlehem, but he ends up in Nazareth. So they have that, but every story is different. They have lots of different stories in the 2. The stories in Matthew, for example, about the Magi or Herod killing the children, not found in Luke. And so he doesn't take over some stories, and the themes that he takes over, he presents differently. So the reason Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but ends up in Nazareth, is completely different between Matthew and Luke. In Matthew, the way it happens is there's not a census that takes them to Bethlehem to register. In Matthew, they're from Bethlehem. Apparently, Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem. They have to move out of Bethlehem because the king is out to kill the child, and they have to get out of there. And so they end up in Nazareth. And so virtually everything's different. And so it's kind of like this: when you, if today you get 2 people telling the same story, and suppose they're telling the same story about some event that happened in New York City last weekend, and say there was a pride parade or something, and they say, oh, there's pride parade, and it went down Madison Avenue, and there were some protesters by the side waving signs, but it all came out okay. So but they have lots of stories like telling it, like they take each of them takes 5 pages to tell that story, but they got those things in common. How would you know whether one of them used the other for its source? The fact they have some the basic commonalities the same doesn't show it, because you'll have news stories commonly having the same thing. So what you look for, you say, well, okay, is there any evidence that this one used that one? Well, what do you look for? What you look for example, are verbatim agreements. Like, suppose you've got a sentence, like some sentence on some random thing in this one, and it's the same sentence about the same random thing in this one. Like, if it's word for word the same, you're saying, wait a second, how'd that happen? And like, you got a couple more instances of that, and you say, man, this is plagiarism. That's how you detect plagiarism, is when you have verbatim agreements. If you have broad thematic similarities, it doesn't make somebody copying somebody. I don't think you've got that kind of agreement between Matthew and Luke in these chapters. And so I think I don't think that, I think the burden of proof would be on somebody who says, well, yeah, Luke got it from Matthew. And you'd have to have some good arguments. And all you have are these basic themes. And so I don't think there's much of a way to mount a case.
All right. When exactly was the woman caught up in adultery added to the Gospel of John? Is it really the case that it wasn't even in there until around 500 CE?
So let me look up my trusty apparatus so I make sure I don't get this wrong. Where we go? So what used to be said, I actually wrote an article on this many years ago, where just about everybody except for fundamentalists agrees that this passage was not original. It's missing. It is so widely missing. Let me just tell you the date, and then I'll tell you about my article. So, where did it go? Okay. So the first time it is added here, sorry. When's the first time it's added? It looks like it's added by different manuscripts, obviously, at different times. But the first time it looks like it's added is in around the year 400 in Codex Bezae in a manuscript. So around the year 400. Before that, we have a number of witnesses that are lacking it. And so there are lots of reasons for thinking it wasn't original that are not just about the manuscripts. For one thing, the writing style changes pretty interestingly right after. But the writing style before this is a kind of a consistent writing style. This story is a different writing style. And then right after this story, you have the same writing style. And so you have to examine that in the Greek, looking at detail. But that's pretty much agreed by everybody. There are things in this passage that don't really work very well in the context. So people look at that. So there are a range of things about that. So the answer to your question is it first shows up in Codex Bezae around the year 400. I wrote an article on this thing once that argued I had to deal with I dealt with two arguments. One thing is that when people point out that this thing appears like it was not original, they always say, or typically they say, that there's no Greek commentator on the Gospel of John that mentions this until the 12th century. And yeah, well, that's actually right. And people writing commentaries on the Gospel of John don't mention it to the 12th century. And it's often thought you don't really have much evidence of this before that in any church father. When I was doing my dissertation on Didymus the Blind, a 4th century church father, I found a passage where he actually summarizes this text. And he's living in the 4th century. And so I wrote an article showing that this was actually, it appears that a form of this story was already known to Didymus the Blind in the 4th century. But it's not an early edition, and it's so, there's so many arguments against it that even when I was an evangelical Christian, I knew this thing wasn't original. And that's the consensus, really.
All right, let's take some super chat questions. Michael E, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on Christian atheism from Slavoj Zizek or Thomas Altizer, like Hegel? They argue God dies on the cross, remaining is the Holy Spirit, an egalitarian collective of believers bound by love.
I would say those are theological views. I'm not a theologian. And so, even though they're atheistic views, they do have, they're dealing with kind of an interpretation of the text that's trying to make it meaningful in a kind of a religious sense. And so, so it kind of depends what one means. I mean, they're not doing an analysis, like an interpretive analysis of any of the individual gospels when they say things like that. They're thinking in kind of broader philosophical terms. And so it's their way of making sense of these passages philosophically. Just as an example, to say that the Holy Spirit is an egalitarian collective of believers bound by love, that could be a very powerful thought. That the Holy Spirit isn't some entity, a member of the divine Trinity that is doing things here among us, but in fact, it represents a kind of a natural thing that the believers in Christ now are bound together by their faith and their love, and they form a community, and that's the manifestation of the Holy Spirit. That would certainly fit in with a Hegelian philosophy where there isn't any real spirit. In the theological sense, but it's not an exegesis of these passages. For me, I'm far more interested in what these passages are saying, and I'm not trying to redeem them for any modern theological or philosophical purpose. I'm interested in what Mark has to say about the death of Jesus, what Luke has to say about the death of Jesus. I'm interested in how those interpretations might have relevance for people today. But I don't have the agenda of systematic theology, which is trying to take the biblical message and come up with a kind of a coherent, unified message that could be important to Christians today. These philosophers are following in the steps of those systematic theologians who have been around forever, who are trying to come up with kind of a unified message of philosophical importance. And I'm not against that endeavor at all. It's not something that I'm particularly engaged in. And it is, of course, it's in terms of a historical phenomenon, it's interesting that people like Zizek and and others have gotten interested in this kind of analysis. But that's culturally and intellectually interesting, but it's not something I have really any way of commenting on.
Hard work. Thank you for your super chat. Can Dr. Ehrman please explain his opinion on the coherence-based geological method? And he corrected a misspelling here. He says autocorrect changed my text.
Genealogical.
Chat should be genealogical.
Yeah, genealogical method. Yeah. Right. Okay. So earlier, Jacob, when you asked me about family groups, I described what you were asking me about, which is how traditionally scholars have collected manuscripts into groups and evaluated which groups are superior to other groups to help them decide which texts are original. About, I don't know how long ago now, 20 years, 25 years ago or so, out of this group in Munster that I mentioned that is producing this new edition of the Nestle-Aland text, the Nestle-Aland 29th, out of that group, especially one scholar in the group, Gert Mink, devised a method that's called the coherence-based genealogical method. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs, for which you can thank me. It would take a long time and it's very detailed. But what I will say is this is a method that tries to get rid of the need to group manuscripts. It does not think that it's useful to talk about an Alexandrian text, a Byzantine text, a Western text, a Caesarean text. They don't think that that's useful and that it's outdated. And now with computer technology, we don't have to do that. What the coherence-based genealogical method does, in short, is it tries to understand the genealogical relationship not of manuscripts, but of variant readings. And the way it does it is it takes any reading or it's different. So suppose you've got a verse and you've got like 3 words that are worded differently in some manuscripts than others, that are like a unit, a sense unit of 3 words. It's different here, different there, maybe different there. What they do is they come up, they list all the variants and they have all which manuscripts have which variants. And then they try to figure out which of these variant readings probably came from the other readings based on a computer analysis, based on the data that they feed into the computer. And the computer chunks it out so that you can show how these readings related to each other genealogically, which one first came to the next, and which one's influenced by which one, and which one that. And you do that for each variant reading, but then you feed all the data into a computer, and it establishes the coherence of the entire tradition for that book, showing which readings are the oldest readings, and which readings came from those oldest readings. And so it's a computerized model that would have been impossible before now. It is ignoring the it's in my judgment, it is somewhat ignoring. People will object to this, but who know the method, it's somewhat ignoring. It is ignoring what the original text was. It's trying to find what the originating variant was that originated all the other manuscripts, but it doesn't ask the question, was that what the author originally wrote? The method can't solve that. And so it's, in a sense, it's leaving behind some of the evidence that I think is important, which is trying to figure out which of the variant readings that survive past the criteria of which one is more likely for this particular author to have written based on a number of considerations. So it is the order of the day. It's how people are proceeding. I don't find the results to be significant so far, even though they claim that they're really highly significant. But when you look at the results, for me, they don't add up to a lot. But I will admit I'm out of the field now. I'm not doing textual criticism now. I haven't been doing textual criticism for really 15 or 20 years now. And so so to that extent, I'm not the best person probably to ask about it, but I have not been overwhelmed by the results, and I have serious doubts about the method, but I'm a dinosaur in the field. And so, what I say doesn't really have much effect on anything. I think the most interesting part of textual criticism is deciding what an author wrote and why somebody changed it. For me, that's detective work. And I also think it's really interesting to figure out why scribes were changing texts. That's a historical question that you can't solve with a computer. The things that I'm most interested in, mounting arguments for which variant reading is older than others and why you had changes. You've got to mount historical and literary arguments for that. And I think people who practice the coherence-based genealogical method just don't do that. In my experience, I will get some people complaining to me about this.
Let's get to the next super chat. Swords to Plowshares. Thank you for your super chat. Are there any other differences between manuscripts of Mark with the added ending and those without it, i.e., missing parables, pericope, etc.?
Yes, there are thousands and thousands of differences between the manuscripts, whether they have the ending or not. Those who have the ending have differences among them. Those who don't have the ending have differences among them, but they don't have other large-scale omissions. And so it's not the kind of situation that you might hope for, where you had a bunch of manuscripts that lack the ending and also are missing this parable, and they're missing this healing story, and they all have that in common. It's not like that. It's just that most manuscripts have the ending. The few that don't have the ending don't have other large chunks missing. They still have lots of disagreements among them.
The next one, Terry Truster, thank you for your super chat. The Essenes believed in spiritual resurrection. First century Judaism wasn't a monolith. Disciplines had Essene theology. Why do you say they didn't believe in spiritual resurrection when they did?
I think it means disciples had an Essene ideology.
Yeah.
I don't think the disciples had an Essene ideology. I think that Jesus and the Essenes had a similar ideology in the sense that they were apocalyptic, as were other Jewish groups. I think the idea that the Essenes believed in a spiritual resurrection is coming from Josephus, and I don't think historically that it's right. I don't think the Essenes did believe in a spiritual resurrection. They believed they had a very physical understanding for the apocalypse with an apocalyptic worldview, as did other Jews who believed in resurrection. There were some Jews who did not believe in resurrection. The one that we know of are the Sadducees. But it's not because they believed in a spiritual resurrection. It's because they didn't believe in an afterlife. They thought you died, that's the end of the story. That's the view found throughout the Hebrew Bible. It's the Old Testament view. And the Sadducees had that view. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection. The Essenes believed in a resurrection. Followers of Jesus believed in a resurrection. John the Baptist believed in a resurrection. Paul believed in a resurrection. These are all apocalyptic Jews. So in all those cases, I think you can show that they subscribe to the idea of a physical resurrection. When Jesus says that at the resurrection there'll be no marriage nor giving in marriage, he's talking about physical union in marriage. And so it's clear that he's not, spirits, bodies marry, people marry. And so I think he's clearly talking about a physical resurrection in contrast to the Sadducees whom he's answering. So I don't think Josephus's descriptions of the four philosophical schools are particularly accurate. At least they don't seem to coincide with what we have from other evidence.
All right. Mr. Warlight, thank you for your super chat. Luke and Matthew have different blessed be the poor parts in the Sermon on the Mount. Which version was written first? Did Luke copy an earlier sermon?
So Matthew and Luke both have the Beatitudes, but they have them in different forms and in different places in their Gospels. The parts they have are often word for word the same. So they both have blessed are the poor, but Matthew has blessed are the poor in spirit. And Luke has blessed are you poor. Matthew has blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Luke has blessed are you who hunger and thirst. There's obviously a difference between hungering for righteousness and being hungry. Luke seems to be emphasizing more of a social agenda, concern for those who are poor, concern for those who are hungry, and throughout his gospel, concern for those who are outcast, concern for women who didn't have as high of a status as men in that world. Luke has these kinds of social agenda. This question is particularly, though, about the Beatitudes. The question is, why in these Beatitudes and in other parts of Matthew and Luke, for example, the Lord's Prayer, their prayers differ in some ways. Matthew's is longer, and there's some words that are different, but they have a lot of words that are just the same. Or you'll have parables that are virtually the same, or other sayings virtually the same. How's that work? Why is that? So scholars have long debated this, but since the 19th century, the consensus among scholars, it's not an overwhelming consensus now because there are people who have different opinions, but still the majority view among scholars, so far as I can tell, is that Matthew and Luke have these passages in common because they are copying a common source. It does not look like Luke copied Matthew or that Matthew copied Luke. The reason for thinking that is because these passages they have in common, where they've got word for words the same, those are the passages in Matthew and Luke that are in different sequences in Matthew and Luke. When Matthew and Luke also have word for word agreements that are found in Mark, in other words, they both copied Mark. So you get a passage in Mark, Matthew copies it, Luke copies it. So sometimes all three will have the same wording. Sometimes Matthew and Mark will have the same wording, but Luke will have something different. Sometimes Mark and Luke will have something the same thing, Matthew will have it different. You get these various combinations. But these passages show that there's copying going on because they're verbatim agreements. And since all three have them in common, you can compare all three and you can work it out that Mark appears to have been copied by Matthew and Luke. When you have those passages where Matthew and Luke, Matthew copied Mark, Luke copied Mark, when you have those in common, Matthew and Luke generally have these passages in the same sequence. When Matthew and Luke have word for word agreements in passages not in Mark, they're almost always sayings. They're in different sequences. If Luke was copying Matthew, then you would think that he'd at least keep some of the same sequences for the materials in Matthew, because Luke does keep the same sequence for the material from Mark. So that shows that probably Matthew and Luke are not copying each other. So they probably caught it from a common source, and the common source is usually called Q. Q is it's short for the German word Quelle. Scholars who invented this were German scholars. They didn't invent Q. They invented the idea of Q. They came up with the idea that Matthew and Luke had a common source for their sayings. So it's called the sayings source. And so it's the sayings Quelle. So they just call it Q for the saying source, Q, because Quelle starts with a Q, Quelle. So Luke probably was copying Q at this point, making some changes possibly. Matthew's copying Q at this point, making some changes probably. So yes, Luke was copying some of the source probably. Which wording is the oldest? Did Jesus originally say, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," or did he say, "Blessed are the poor"? Scholars will go back and forth on this. I think the majority view continues to be that when you have those kinds of differences, more often Luke is presenting the older form. And that's what I think. I think Luke is presenting Jesus' social agenda because Luke agrees with Jesus' social agenda that you should take care of the poor and you take care of the hungry. And Matthew has more of a kind of a spiritualized view of it. What matters isn't poverty. What matters is being poor in spirit, in other words, humble or meek. What matters is not hungering and thirsting. Well, why does that matter? What matters is you hunger and thirst for righteousness. It's more of a spiritual teaching. So I think Luke has the older version, probably the one that was in Q. Matthew's changed it, not because he changed Luke, but because he changed Q.
What is Mr. World? I figured for you super chat. What is the relation between the Ebionite Gospel and Mark, since both have the same elements, beginning with the baptism? Was one based on the other?
So we have a Gospel of the Ebionites that's called that, and I assume this. I'm going to assume that Mr. Warlight is talking about that, because sometimes people, he may be talking about something else, because sometimes when people say the Ebionite gospel, what they mean is like a Jewish Christian gospel that is talked about, that is kind of this like amalgamation of things from church fathers, and you just call it the Ebionite gospel. We actually have a book called The Gospel According to the Ebionites. And so I'm going to assume he's talking about that. That gospel we have only in quotations from church fathers. We don't have the thing. We don't have like a manuscript of this gospel. In fact, it's not church fathers. It's a church father. A 4th century church father named Epiphanius quotes a gospel that he says is the gospel of the Ebionites. The Ebionites was one of the Jewish Christian groups in the early church. They appear to have had a gospel, as did other Jewish Christian groups. One of the things that's most interesting about this gospel of the Ebionites is that it appears to have been a gospel that was harmonizing other gospel texts. By harmonizing, I mean, you know how sometimes you'll have a different story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. One way to harmonize that is to take Matthew, Mark, Luke's version of the story and to combine them into one big story, where all the elements of Matthew and all the elements in Mark and all the elements of Luke are in one account. People do this mentally all the time. So when people talk about the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, you may have heard of that. What are Jesus' 7 last words? And so he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He says, Father, into your hands I've committed my spirit. And he says all these things. He doesn't say all those things in any of the Gospels. In Matthew he says a couple of these things, and Mark he says one of those things, and Luke he says a few of these things, and so you take them all and you smash them together, and then you get the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, and you could call that like the American gospel or something. I don't know, but so the Ebionite the gospel of the Ebionites though appears to have been an actual gospel that did something similar. It put the stories together. And the reason for thinking of that is one of the reasons for thinking it, the best reason for thinking of it, is because when Epiphanius quotes this gospel, he quotes its account of the birth of the baptism. And so probably this gospel, as this questioner said, does start with the baptism narrative. I pointed out earlier that in Mark's gospel, the voice from heaven says, "You are my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." I also pointed out that in Matthew's gospel, it says, "This is my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." And you think, well, who cares? Well, actually, there's a difference. Because in Mark's account, the voice is coming only to Jesus. No one else is said to hear the voice. That's interesting because throughout Mark's gospel, one of the leading themes is that nobody can figure out how Jesus can be the Son of God. And at the baptism, nobody's told it, just Jesus. In Matthew's gospel, people have no problem figuring out who Jesus is, more commonly. And the voice doesn't come to Jesus, it comes to the crowds. "This is my beloved son," or possibly just to John the Baptist. "This is my beloved son." God's telling someone else, not telling Jesus. Okay? But then you get to Luke, and as I pointed out in Luke, it looks like the voice originally in the oldest form of Luke, it looks like the voice said, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." Well, how do you reconcile that? What did the voice actually say? In the Gospel of the Ebionites, as Epiphanius quotes it, the three accounts are reconciled. Because in that account, the voice comes 3 times. And so what happens in that account is, Epiphanius quotes it, and he just quotes the passage, and he says, according to the Gospel of the Ebionites, the voice came from heaven and said to Jesus, "You are my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." And later, the voice came and spoke to the crowd, "This is my beloved son, in whom I'm well pleased." So first spoke what Mark said, then said what Matthew said, and then John the Baptist asked something about, like, how can this be the Son of God? And the voice then comes a third time, says, "You are my beloved son, today I have begotten you." And so the voice comes 3 times in this gospel. And so it's so it does look like the Gospel of the Ebionites did begin with a baptism scene. It appears that he did know the Gospel of Mark, but it appears that he also knew Matthew and Luke. And he tried to combine these into one complementary account where you don't have differences among the Gospels. You got one Gospel that's coherent. Many people listening to this will realize that is similar to what happened in the 2nd century at the hands of a more famous Christian author who took the 4 Gospels and he combined them into one Gospel. So it's a church father named Tatian, who was a disciple of Justin, martyr, whom I mentioned earlier, around the year 150. He went to Rome. He was from Syria. He went to Rome, and even though he was from Syria, and he learned Greek, but at some point he composed a gospel that was the 4 Gospels put together into one big gospel that was a kind of a gospel harmony. And that big gospel of Tatian's is called the Diatessaron. Dia means through. Tessaron means 4, through the 4. This is the one gospel that comes through the 4 Gospels. This became the gospel that was widely used in Syria for centuries. They did not use Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John separately from them, and they actually called those the separate Gospels, but they used the Diatessaron. And it is much to our regret that we no longer have a copy of the Diatessaron. One of the hardest parts of New Testament studies in textual criticism, one of the most difficult tasks, is trying to figure out what the Diatessaron looked like, how it was worded. And there have been big disputes about that, even over the last 30 years, the entire sea change about how people go about doing that. But it is incredibly difficult. You've got to know all these other languages. It's really hard. But it would be an account of a gospel harmony that was like the Gospel of the Ebionites in its intent, in many ways, but it could not have been the Gospel of the Ebionites. It had to be a different gospel for reasons I don't need to go into. But so there were gospel harmonies like that, and so that was the Gospel of the Ebionites.
When was Luke 22:43 to 44 added?
Okay, back to the text. So Luke 22:43 through 44 was the first passage that I devoted a piece of scholarship to. And so it's always been an important text for me. When I was a graduate student, I think it was my first year in my graduate program, a friend of mine and I started collaborating about this passage, and we ended up writing a scholarly article on it, and it's the first scholarly article that I produced in conjunction with this other fellow. This is named Mark Plunkett. The passage is about Jesus praying before he's arrested. So he has his Last Supper. Judas goes out to get the soldiers to come arrest Jesus, and Jesus. So I'm gonna tell you what's in this passage. Jesus goes out and he goes to the Mount of Olives. His disciples are following him. He comes to the place where he wants to be, Mount of Olives, and he tells them, "Pray that you not enter into temptation." Then he leaves them, goes about a stone's throw away, and he kneels down and he prays, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know." Father, I'm sorry. "Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will be done." And then we're told that Jesus came to be in deep agony and began sweating as if like drops of blood dropping from his head to the ground, and an angel came and comforted him. Then he arose from prayer and came to the disciples and found them sleeping. And he said to them, "Why do you sleep? Rise and pray that you not enter into temptation." So it begins and ends with that same injunction: pray that you not enter into temptation. The two of those verses that I just quoted are not in some of our manuscripts. It's called the passage of the bloody sweat. You know, today people talk about sweating blood. I think it comes from these verses. Jesus begins to sweat drops as if of blood, and an angel comes to comfort him. He's in deep agony. So it's chapter 22, verses 43 to 44 of Luke. And the question is, did these two verses originally belong to Luke? The verses that say that he starts sweating as if blood and he's comforted by an angel. They're missing from our oldest and best manuscripts, but they're found in other very good and early manuscripts. And so, which is it? Were they originally there or not? Well, it kind of depends on which manuscripts you read. The manuscripts are divided, but there are good reasons based on the writings of the Church Fathers that both forms of the text were known early. They got changed probably in the second Christian century. The first time they get quoted, those verses get quoted, is in the writings of Justin Martyr again. And they get quoted by two other church fathers living a few decades later. So whether they were in there or not, they're omitted in an early manuscript. They're found in early church fathers. And so the change came sometime in the second century. So the question is, did scribes add those verses or did scribes take them out? That's the question. It is hotly debated among scholars. There continue to be dispute, but I am absolutely convinced of my view of this, which goes back to, whenever I was doing this in 1982 or something. And I wrote up a long discussion of it in my book, Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. And I wrote up a shorter description in my book, Misquoting Jesus, where I try to show that originally these verses were missing from the text. That they weren't there. They're not original. I have a number of arguments for this. Some of them have to do with the manuscripts. Some of them have to do with the coherence of the passage. If you take those verses out, the passage is very interesting because it formed. Okay, why not? I'll tell you what. The stylistic argument. This is the one my friend came up with. Is that without these verses, they form a chiasmus. So the way a chiasmus is a Greek rhetorical form, and the way it works is you got a passage, and it says this, and this. Okay, but you start looking at it closely, and the beginning thing that it says is just like the last thing it says. And the second thing is a lot like the second to last thing. And the third thing is a lot like the third to last thing. And so like it goes from A to B to C, and then it goes from then you've got something like C, you call it C1, something B1 and A1. And it's called a chiasmus because it looks like an X, which X is the letter chi in Greek. And so it's called a chiasmus. So the point of a chiasmus is to make a literary argument, and you've got the beginning, you get 1, 2, you get A, B, C, and then if you got a D, the D is in the very middle, and there's no D1. It goes then goes from D to C1, B1, A1. Okay, you see that? And so without those verses, you have this perfect chiasmus. And I don't believe in chiasmus as much. I don't think they hardly ever occur, but I think this one is. So Jesus, it begins with Jesus telling the disciples, pray that you not enter into temptation. It ends with Jesus praying that you not enter into temptation. He leaves them. He returns to them. He kneels down. He gets up. And in the middle of that thing is his prayer, Father, take away this cup from me. But your will be done, not mine. The center of this thing is this prayer to God. Okay? It begins with saying, pray so you not enter into temptation. It ends with pray you not enter into temptation. What do? Do they pray? No. We're told in the next verse they'd fallen asleep. They don't pray. What happens next? The soldiers come and arrest Jesus. What do those who were told to pray that you not enter into temptation do when the soldiers come? They flee. They get out of there. They're not willing to stand up and stay there. They enter into temptation. Jesus does not try to flee. He does not enter temptation because he's the one who prayed. It's right in the center of the chiasmus. So the chiasmus emphasizes the need to pray not to enter into temptation. The two verses that are added, he sweats blood and an angel comes and comforts him. It disrupts the chiasmus. Disrupts the order of the way it's structured. Not only that, but even more important, it introduces into Luke's account something that is completely absent otherwise. More than that, it's not just absent. Luke took this emphasis out of Mark, his source. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is really distraught going to his death. He tells his disciples in Mark that my soul is burdened unto death. He doesn't say that in Luke. Luke takes that verse out. He kneels down in deep agony in Mark. In deep agony is taken out in Luke. In fact, he doesn't kneel in Mark. He falls on his face. In Luke, he calmly takes his knees. Point after point where Mark is emphasizing the agony, Luke takes it out. So it doesn't make sense that if he wants to get rid of Jesus' agony, that what he puts in is his agony. And you can't say that he put it in to replace these other things because there's no reason to get rid of those other things. You keep them and this agony. And also, you don't do that because you destroyed the chiasmus. And so, anyway, so I've got this long argument that involved things like that to try and show that, in fact, these verses, the sweating, the bloody sweat, were added to Luke, were not original to Luke. And the reason they were added, this is another part of the argument, is because they show Jesus being very, very human. The three church fathers who quote this, the earliest attestations of these verses, the ones who first quote this verse, use it in order to show that Jesus was fully human in the face of other Christians who are saying Jesus was God, but he's not human. These verses show he's sweating blood. He's in agony. He is human. And so I think these verses are added because Luke had gotten rid of all the agony. And now this passage can be used to show Jesus didn't even get anxious at the end. Oh, yes, he did. Sweat and blood. And so I think it was added as a opposition against those who don't think that Jesus was fully human, was only divine.
When was the Johannine comma added?
Right. Okay. Johannine comma. I don't talk about this in my book because my book is dealing with textual alterations done in the 2nd and 3rd century for Christological reasons, and the Johannine comma was added after that. So let me tell you what the Johannine comma is. So the term comma for us means a punctuation mark. You know, you put the punctuation mark. But the reason you put that punctuation mark there is because you're saying that this group of words set off from the next group of words. A comma is actually a kind of a group of words that cohere together, but it's not a full sentence necessarily. And so the Johannine comma is an addition of a group of words, not just a word or two, but an entire group of words that have an internal sense. And it's a very famous passage because it's the only one in the New Testament, if it were in the New Testament, that explicitly affirms that affirms the doctrine of the Trinity. You can get the doctrine of the Trinity elsewhere in the New Testament by taking this verse about God being the only God, or that verse about Jesus being God, or that verse about Spirit being like Jesus and being God. And you take verse here, and then you put them together, and you can come up with a doctrine of the Trinity. But the doctrine of the Trinity is never explicitly expressed except in this disputed passage, which is not much disputed because everybody agrees it wasn't originally there. In this case, even conservative evangelical, unless you're a fundamentalist, just about everybody agrees this thing wasn't there. The doctrine of the Trinity is not simply mentioning Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit named in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 and 20, baptize the converts in the names of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That's not the doctrine of the Trinity. The doctrine of the Trinity is not the existence of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's their relationship to one another. It's the technical definition that God comes in three persons. There's one God, but in three distinct persons. The three persons are distinct from one another. They are not the same person. There are three distinct persons, but those three are one. So that doesn't make mathematical sense. It doesn't really make logical sense. It's not supposed to make sense, but it's the doctrine of the Trinity, that the Godhead is three persons who are distinct, but the three are one. You don't find that statement anywhere in the New Testament. It doesn't develop until the 4th century. But you have this passage called the Johannine comma. And so this is 1 John, the epistle, 1 John chapter 5. When you read chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, it says, all right, the Spirit is the witness because the Spirit is the truth. Okay, so I'm sorry. Yeah, okay. Let me start with verse 6, actually. This is he who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ, not with the water only, but with the water and the blood. And the Spirit is the witness, because the Spirit is the truth. Okay, that's the lead up. I'm not going to interpret that here. Verse 8 then. There are three witnesses: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And the three are one. Okay, so the Spirit, the water, and blood all testify to Jesus Christ. So the three are one. But there are some witnesses that have an addition in Latin, that say, hold on, I've got to get this. Let me find my apparatus. There it is. All right. In Greek and in Latin, you have the thing where it says there are three witnesses: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. The addition to the text, the Johannine comment, says there are three witnesses in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit. And these three are one. And there are three witnesses on earth: the Spirit, the water, and the blood. And these three are one. Wait a second. You have the addition, not just of the Spirit, water, and blood, but you have the addition of, you have three who are in heaven: the Father, the Word, and the Spirit, and these three are one. That's the statement of the Trinity. Those verses are missing from all of our early and best manuscripts. And so it is absolutely an addition to the text. They do get quoted in church fathers that may go back to the 4th century. It may have first been found in quotations of church fathers in the 4th century, the 5th century. It doesn't get added to the New Testament until a little bit later, around then, in Latin manuscripts. There are some Greek manuscripts that do contain this, but they are very late Greek manuscripts, medieval manuscripts. So it probably was a gloss on the text, kind of an explanation of the three are one: the Spirit, the water, and the blood, by somebody who wants to say that this is applicable to the doctrine of the Trinity that was emerging in the 4th century. And so they added the statement. Somebody added that as an interpretation. Somebody then stuck it in a manuscript. And so the manuscripts that were being used, the manuscripts that developed, had these. And the manuscript used to translate the King James Version had the verse. And that's why English speakers are familiar with the verse, because it's found in the King James, because King James is based on later manuscripts.
So I'm going to take a couple more super chats. We're going to be missing some super chats, but we are pretty much at the end. I'll take this one real fast because there's no question here.
Very good.
No question, just thanks. Thank you, Offer. Thank you for your super chat. And the last super chat question I will take, because it's on topic, is from Hand of Omega. Thank you for your super chat. Is the longer Acts the one in the Bible? Which version is best, and what's a good translation of it?
So the longer text of Acts is found in some manuscripts, especially Codex Bezae, and it is not the one that is usually translated. There must be translations of it, but I don't know of any for a popular audience. But it's significantly different, over 7% different, longer than the 7.5% longer than the text found in most and best manuscripts. So it has additional verses here and there.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Bart Ehrman.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it. It's been down in the weeds a bit, but it's been fun.
Likewise. And I just want to remind everybody to check out the History Valley Amazon affiliate link to get the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, and also to check out Bart Ehrman's course on the Orthodox Corruption of Scripture in the History Valley affiliate link, History Valley 5-card affiliate link in the description below. And I'll see everybody later. Thanks again, Bart.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.